Some of you may know Historic New England if you visited one of our museum sites, perhaps Gropius House in Lincoln or Eustis Estate in Milton. Both of those will be featured in our lecture today. But for those who are new to Historic New England, it is the oldest and largest regional preservation organization in the country. And as part of its mission, Historic New England saves and shares historic homes, open space, collections, and stories from the past and today. And through our work, we also hope to inspire good preservation practices beyond our site and across the region. So within the organization, I'm part of the Preservation Services team, which builds partnerships between Historic New England and other organizations and individuals who have the shared goal of preserving historic properties throughout the region. The Preservation Services team does this by working with private property owners in our easement program or through our homeowner services program available to members. We also provide technical guidance and are involved in advocating for historic resources and providing educational opportunities like today's lecture. So more of what you're interested to hear about today is stone walls, so we're going to jump into that here now. So to give you a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going, it's easy to think about stone walls as a pile of rocks, albeit a very carefully put together pile of rocks, or that deciding to repair a stone wall can't be that complicated. But today we'll delve into the history and trends in stone wall building, and then we'll look at some of the current legal and legal protections and preservation efforts, and then finally some construction and considerations when you're tackling wall repairs or preservation. So all right, part one is history of stone walls. So when the English arrived in New England, they brought agricultural practices that were radically different from the indigenous people who were here that permanently changed the landscape. So today we see this in thousands of miles of stone walls threading through our communities or Martha's Vineyard, bordering fields, defining roads, wandering through the woods. There are so many different types of stone walls. Some are single walls, double walls, estate walls, freestanding piles of stone, retaining walls. There's so many descriptors that we'll cover a lot of them in today's lecture. And you'll start to notice some of these differences as you're out in the community looking at each of them. But they're all an enduring representation of when and where and the time that they were constructed. We'll see some distinctive local variations of rounded versus flat stones, different colors, different heights and widths of wall. And while some walls were finely built, for public display, others were just a mere container for stones. So in 1939, mining engineer Oliver Bowles estimated there are approximately 240,000 miles of stone walls in New England. So to give you a little bit of a reference point, this is the same distance, or this is further than the distance from the moon to the moon, or the length of the entire United States coastline. So a lot of miles of walls. He used the 1872 Department of Agriculture report on fences to estimate this distance. But the question really is, why are there so many in New England? I mean, we see some stone walls in other parts of the country, but none of them have the miles and miles of stone walls that we have here. Often we hear about the glaciers that covered New England, but it's more than that, because I grew up in Michigan, and you can see from this map here that almost all of the Midwest is covered by this shade of gray that's representing the glacier. I grew up, I was in the Saginaw Valley, it formed the Saginaw Valley, it created the lakes, it was the agriculture, we heard glaciers all over when I was growing up, was a key part of learning about Michigan history. And so it's more than just that. There are also two other factors that are playing into this, and not just the glaciers, although they are a key factor. The other is the geology that is in these different parts of the areas. So if you're looking at the Midwest, the bedrock there is actually more of a sandstone or a limestone. It's a very soft stone, so when the glaciers came through, most of it was just crushed and scraped away. While in New England, we get harder stones like granite. And so when the glaciers came through, they crushed that stone and more often broke it up into smaller pieces, and it kind of, as they receded, it tumbled with it, but they still left, these big stones rather than smashing it to smithereens like the sandstone would have been. And so that's another key difference is, we've got the glaciers, but we also have that bedrock type that's different between the Midwest and the Northeast that contributes to stone walls being here. The third factor is that plays a key role in the existence of stone walls is the deforestation that happened. And it takes all three of these factors. And so let's look at the results of deforestation in the area. So in looking at the image on the left here, you see this nice thick topsoil. After deforestation, we lose that protection that the trees that kept that topsoil in place, so a lot of erosion happened. And this starts to expose some of the sublayers of the soil. So you're starting to have ones that had that nice kind of a blanket of topsoil over them are now without that. And so the frost is penetrating deeper, there's deeper groundwater is freezing, and so you're getting this frost heave that's getting down into this kind of abolition till layer here, and it's pushing those stones. You see this nice pile of stones here. They're getting pushed up after deforestation up to the surface. And so every winter this process is happening, and this spring thaw brings more rocks to the surface. And so when you combine the frost heave, the deforestation, the glaciers, and the geology that was here, you get stone walls. So the height of stone wall construction really begins in the mid-1700s. It's after the Revolutionary War. So the colonists were confronted with timber shortages and fields with increasing amounts of stone. So it was a couple of generations later where we really get this prolific stone wall construction. And so after decades of clearing the forests, they are faced with, fences that got damaged during the war. Their wood is no longer as available as it was when they first moved here, so it becomes too precious of a commodity for fencing. But they have this abundance of stone. And while it's much more labor intensive to build these stone walls, they have a plethora of the materials, and so it starts to become an alternative for wood fencing. But even with that, we have earlier examples of stone walls as well. So Historic New England has 38 museum sites across the region with staff scattered at them. But my office is based at Lyman Estate in Waltham. And so this past fall, I had the chance to connect with the chair of the Waltham Historical Commission and talk to him about some of the research that he had been doing specifically on stone walls in Waltham. And so you'll remember, we were talking about that prolific period, but this is a key example of some stone walls that were even earlier than that. And so this wall, although a seemingly simple kind of couple of stones that don't really catch your attention, like maybe some of the more ones that bound the roads or kind of taller, or the double walls, these line of stones actually ties to the settling of Waltham and the great dividend grants that laid out Waltham in 1636. So we'll look at this map, shows those original grant plots. And then this is a map of Waltham today. So you can see the shape of Waltham is pretty much stay the same. There's some little tweaks to the boundary lines, but it's still that general shape. And so when they were laying out the great dividend grants consisted of 120 lots amongst 120 freemen of Watertown. This was generally wealthier men who were the founders of the town. So the lots were divided into 4 groups of 30 lots, and this is called squadrons. And so you can kind of see on the map here that they generally had these 4 lines. Some of them have a bit of a jig in it if they're getting around like a pond or a natural formation, but for the most part, they're these half-mile wide squadron lines is what they're called, and they're about 5 miles long. And so at first glance, when we're looking at this row of stones here, we're thinking it's just some stones, but it actually lines up with one of the squadron lines in Waltham. And so this seemingly simple kind of nondescript line of stones is actually really tied to the founding of the town and the history of the community. And stone walls are also tied a lot of times to the social history and the people of a community. So there's stories about people tied to them as well as founding of towns. So they were the work of innumerable laborers whose existence may not otherwise be recorded. So this may be the only work that we know of that these people had. Even if we don't know their name, we know there was somebody who constructed these. So depending on where and when stone walls were built, it could have been from farmers or field hands, enslaved, indentured. It could be freed, indigenous, or black people. There's, the records, we've got records that show all of these different types of people that were working on stone walls. And for some of them, this may be the only record of the work or the impact that they had on the community, but that stone wall's still here hundreds of years later. So first-hand accounts of stone wall building can be very limited, but archival records can sometimes open up lenses into history. So among the Casey farm papers are entries from Silas Casey, who's on the top here, and his descendant Thomas Lincoln Casey Sr. on the bottom. And these records detail stone wall efforts at Casey's farm in Saunderstown, Rhode Island. And the entry dates from these records dates from 1777 to 1881, which falls into that prolific period we were talking about in that post-Revolutionary War. But the really kind of interesting thing is some of the details that these records share. There are descriptions of lengths, like 40.75 rods of stone wall were constructed today. And there are types of walls, like there's notes about double walls or reconstruction of walls to do around the house into double walls. And there are also notes of who built them. So we know there's Caesar Northrup was a hired African-American farmhand. And also we know Reynolds Knowles was a tenant farmer at Casey Farm who also worked on the stone walls here. So we're starting to get names with some of these archival records, and as we start to dig into them more, we're finding some more of these histories and connecting them to something as simple as a stone wall, or seemingly as simple as a stone wall, because we all know this is a lot to go into them. So as fields were being prepared for planting in the spring, new stones we were talking about were pushed up to the surface by the winter freeze. And so they're being moved to the outer edges of the fields by stone boats pulled by oxen. And so this aerial illustrates the kind of typical field division of early New England farms. This is Casey Farm today, or just I think this photo's from last year, but pretty close to the same as today. But they're small fields, only a couple of acres, bounded by stone walls. And so this is a map from Middletown, Rhode Island in 1876, and where you see these dashed lines, we're pretty sure is where stone walls existed, kind of delineating some of the fields in Middletown at the time. And we didn't do a full survey, but we were able to kind of line up pretty closely where some of these still exist today. And so we're talking with the stone walls, and at this period, we're talking about subsistence farming, not big commercial entities. This is just farming for the family and a little bit extra, maybe to sell at this time. So stone walls also at this time were used around cemeteries, and on my way in, I just passed the cemetery here, also has a stone wall. So there's lots of examples in your own community for that. They're also used around pasture lands as well as fields. Some communities still have existing town pounds where stray animals were confined, and they're the same dry stone construction that we're seeing of the stone walls. They're usually square with some sort of gate with a lintel above, as you can see in the images here. And these are really important structures in these early kind of formative agricultural communities too. So we're seeing the same construction being, walls being used in different ways, but also some other functions for them. And while we're still in this early period, a lot of times I get questions about how did they move these stones? Because some of them can be picked up by one man, some could be picked up by two people, and others are large, and you're just trying to figure out how in the 18th century that they were moving these things. So some of them would have been too big to move. Some of them they could have drilled holes into and allowed ice to get in there and hoping that the ice would split them apart into a size that they could carry. Later on, you get black powder or dynamite. But a lot of times, if there were, ones that may be a little bit too big for somebody to carry, they were using they're using a crowbar and stone boats and oxen to move these to get them out of the field. And so there's they had ways of doing this that it sometimes kind of escapes us when we're thinking, gosh, you don't have a big John Deere tractor or something to just come up and grab it. But they did have ways that they were moving these stones. But stone walls in part also contributed to the decline of agriculture in New England. By the 1850s, there were about 168,000 small family farms in New England and New York. That covered about 70 to 80% of the region had been cleared and was being farmed. But the region's small fields that we were talking about were adequate for subsistence farming. But as the American Industrial Revolution brought new commercial agricultural market and more demand as people were moving to urban centers, these small walled fields couldn't fulfill the need for that these kind of urban centers were needing for food, and the subsistence farming wasn't enough. And so New England started to compete with these larger commercial size agriculture and farming that was going on in the Midwest, where they didn't have fields that were bound by stone walls, that didn't allow New England to be able to use some of these new horse-powered machinery. And so they start to be abandoned. These family farms are abandoned. So by the end of the 19th century, most of New England's farms were abandoned, either for more fertile ground to the west, so they're kind of following the agriculture as it moves to the west and more commercial farming, or the lure of steady jobs in the factories. And so these fields are left behind, and then they end up returned to the forests. But the stone walls remained. And so this is where, if you're driving, or maybe you kind of look into the woods and you see these stone walls that are lacing through the woods. It doesn't look like there's a house nearby. It doesn't look like it's been farmed. It's usually from this period of abandonment. It's where these stone walls are left behind just as times in agriculture were changing. And so in this image, you can see on the left, this was the Swift Valley region in about the 1890s. And then about 100 years later, as that reforestation happened after the farms were abandoned. But the stone wall building tradition continued into the 19th century, not as agricultural walls, but as statements of affluence. So estate walls served an aesthetic function, enhancing the home's beauty. So in contrast to agricultural walls that were built from stones that were straight from the field on site, a lot of estate walls were actually from quarried stones that were brought into the area and may not have any local ties. So this change in material, we've severed the kind of historical relationship between stone wall building with agriculture and site and farming. The Industrial Revolution also increased demands for stonemasons to construct railroads, bridges, factories, and country estates like historic New England's Eustis Estate in Milton. So until the establishment of large residential estates in the 19th century, Milton was primarily an agricultural community. But its proximity to Boston and the traditional agricultural character of the community drew wealthy residents with the 19th century notions that rural living could counter the industrialization and urban stresses of the city. So in 1878, Eustis Estate became the permanent residence of William Ellery Channing and Edith Hemingway Eustis. So the Eustis House, the outbuildings and boundary walls along Canton Avenue illustrate 17th century stone wall masonry that's still coming from that tradition that we were seeing in the earlier periods and rural living. And while this is not always the case at 19th century sites, these buildings actually were constructed with local stone and stone that was found on site. You'll see, I'll go back to the house here. So the house is done, they did quarry and shape the stones, but they are from kind of the Milton region or around Milton, Massachusetts, while the outbuildings are left in that kind of rounder field stone, unfinished state. And so they also, during the residency at the site, they continued that kind of agricultural use with small farms and hay fields and an ice pond. So as New England landscape continues to be reshaped by generations, agricultural stone walls still endured. And so when Walter and Isa Gropius selected the site to build their house in Lincoln, Massachusetts in 1938, they maintained vestiges of its agricultural past. The house is set on a hilltop site. There's still these historical stone walls that you can see in the front photo here. And there's also an apple orchard on the site. And so a really key thing for Walter Gropius was this integration of these modern architectural designs with these vernacular forms and materials. And that's, you'll see that in the house itself. If you've gone there, we talk about that during the tour, but it's also in the landscape as well, where he's keeping those ties of this kind of modern and this agricultural past. And so he used retaining walls derived from these existing agricultural walls to kind of create a permeable boundary and a nod to its historical function. So the design landscape immediately surrounding the house seamlessly kind of gives way to this historical character of and the kind of agricultural and natural characteristics of the site. And so it's this kind of dialogue between this kind of modern domestic use and the agricultural past that you can see there at the site. Another site, one of Historic New England's museums, is Dole Little. And so this is kind of an interesting, this house was built in circa 1715, but had different changes over the years and kind of centuries of its existence that it was updated. You can see kind of 6/6 windows here and this kind of door frame. But in the 1950s, there was, they kind of did a restoration to take it back to its 18th century. It kind of comes from that colonial revival. We want to peel back those layers of changes. But something that's interesting to note here is you'll see in this photo, this is at least prior to 1940 that it had a wood fence and historically had a wood fence. But in this 1950s, they actually built a stone wall, kind of bringing back those colonial notions at the site. And so we think this stone wall actually dates to the 1950s, even though it was something that they were constructing or could have constructed the site as early as the 18th century. But it's kind of that colonial revival could be a lecture in itself, but it's kind of an interesting, what was going on here, because you can see the windows are brought back to these kind of small diamond frames, and there's, changes and restoration work that was done in both the house itself, but also some of these impressions.
Yeah. That wall looks like it was constructed wet, like that there's mortar or something. Was it? So they didn't use.
There's mortar. At some point, mortar was done at the top of it to kind of help, probably in an attempt to repair or keep some loose stones. But it probably would have been, it's hard to say because it is coming after that, because the estate walls that we saw at Eustis Estate are usually mortared. And so this is coming after where more mortar in walls was happening. So it is.
Colonial was dry.
Yeah. Yes, as she was saying, colonial at the kind of 17th or 18th and 19th century was constructed dry laid, where with estate walls it was mortared, and so that's a little bit of a difference that we're seeing here as well. So stone walls once served a functional purpose, but today they are threads through the landscape. They define the region's historical identity. They're imbued with diverse history of our inhabitants, and they're memorials to the region's agricultural past, those who came before, and they've endured centuries of harsh New England winters. They've withstood regional development pressures and weathered abandonment. So their familiarity makes them both cherished and also often overlooked, and their permanence taken for granted, which leads us to the second part of tonight's lecture. We're going to talk about some legal protections and also some preservation work that's going on to help preserve these kind of quintessential New England landscape features. So let's take a look at some of the threats stone walls face. So despite their significance, the importance, as we've been talking about, they're under threat by both natural and human forces. So roots from vegetation Roots from vegetation and trees can push them apart. Their proximity to driveways and roads makes them subject to vehicle damage. and their seemingly public access leaves them open to theft, and their locations are sometimes inconvenient to development. So in Massachusetts, there is, in New England, there are at least 3 states that have that stone wall legislation to protect stone walls. In Massachusetts, they have it under the Mass General Laws, but with many of these stone wall legislation, it doesn't really, the fine or the outcome isn't really that discouraging. And as I think I can see a few of you have already read, a $10 fine is all that is defined in the Massachusetts general laws. And if you're thinking, even as an average homeowner, $10 is not much to give to if it was something in the way, let alone somebody doing a larger development. Rhode Island also has legislation. They don't specify a fine. It's kind of at the discretion of the judge for damages and how much it would cost. But even examples, I think, of where we had found it being implemented, it was nothing more than $500. And if you're thinking in a big development budget, still more than $10, but still not that much that it would just really discourage somebody from this. New Hampshire also has protections for walls that are along their scenic roads, and there may be additional levels of protection at a local level or in other communities, but these are just kind of the ones that I was able to find that are happening at the state level. So aside from legislative protections, there are numerous groups and conservation organizations and advocacy efforts and documentation efforts, as well as training opportunities that are going on throughout the region to help preserve stone walls. So while the $10 fine in Massachusetts is a little discouraging, there is a lot of effort and advocacy behind stone walls to really be able to preserve them. And so this is just a few of the efforts that I've come across that with the work that I've done with stone walls. So I encourage you to check your local community if there's a way that you can get involved, or local organizations that are preserving stone walls, or if you see construction going on or repair work going on. It's always good to know that the walls are being taken care of, even if our fines are not as discouraging as we would like them to be in the stonewall advocacy world. So next we're going to look at some construction and kind of these 5 principles of stone wall construction. So most walls we come across fit into one of these 3 categories. So I mentioned kind of stone piles. They look a little bit more like they're tossed. Single stock are literally just kind of a single width of stones that are stacked up. We see a lot of, I've read about, I haven't been to Martha's Vineyard yet. I'm still new to New England, and then COVID hit. So I still really want to go see Martha's Vineyard, because they talk about the lace walls in Martha's Vineyard where there's actually kind of gaps, but they're a type of single wall. And then double walls, which are kind of the most formal and kind of most complex of the stone wall construction. And so we're going to take a little bit closer look at the double wall and the construction that goes involved in it. So the Mess model still standing of stone walls rely on basically gravity to keep them in place. A little bit of friction, some gravity, and these walls are standing for hundreds of years. Now these principles are outlined on this slide are from the Dry Stone Wall Association of Great Britain, but our early wall builders would not have had these types of guidelines. They would have brought either this tradition with them or would have been learning sorry, I keep hitting my mouse pad here. Or they would have been learning from trial and error. See what, if something falls down the next winter, that process didn't work. So they really would have been kind of going with their own guides or traditions that they brought with them. But beginning in the 1800s, there are some agricultural publications that did provide limited, but often contradictory advice. So the one consistent thing that we see recommended is to take your time to build your walls and build them well, and to stack stones 1 over 2 or 2 over 1. And so what this creates is a zigzag pattern down the wall. Where in the lower image here, you'll see this kind of vertical line, and so it creates a weak spot in the wall. And granted, although I'm telling you that this is a weak spot, you'll find plenty of walls. You'll go out there and start tracing the thing and be like, there's a vertical, there's a vertical, there's a vertical, and it's been standing for forever. But this is kind of guide of, this should help, because that's kind of something went right there and we don't know what's keeping it up. But this is a way to kind of help give those stones, if you're doing stone wall construction, a little extra strength. So they also recommend stones putting in the wall lengthwise, so this gives a little bit more connection between those two faces so that the wall is working as a whole. And whereas here you're kind of seeing they're very separated, can kind of separate from each other, and is a little less structural. So they also recommend to heart the wall tightly. And so what this is you've got those kind of bigger face stones that you're seeing, but you're putting these little pieces in to create extra friction points and kind of fill gaps. And you're working with a lot of irregular material. So if you got one that's rocking, you kind of pin a little piece under there and you get it nice and stable. So that's where this heart the wall tightly comes from, and it helps to strengthen that wall. And keeping a similar kind of thing with that rocking piece of road, you want to keep your stones level. And then finally kind of building your walls straight. I mean, as a homeowner, you would probably want your straight walls rather than these wiggly, but they do have character. They got some historic character if they're a little wobbly looking. But if you're kind of doing some repair work with the hope that your stone wall will last as long as some of these examples around the region, this is some of the principles that they recommend. So we've got some parts of the stone wall. So this is the lowest level stones are usually the largest. These are your foundation stones. These can be sometimes are buried or partially buried. Really kind of setting that footing for the wall. And as we were talking about with that keeping, our principles, keeping your wall level. So when our mason was working on site, they were using these guidelines to kind of set the courses of the stone walls, even though you're working with irregular materials. They're still kind of following some of those brick masonry guides, trying to keep that courses level. Your face stones, so those are the stones that you're actually seeing on the outside of the walls. And then we were talking about that hardening tightly is one of our 5 principles. And so there's the pinning stones, which are keeping them from wobbling, and then that hardening stone is kind of filling in those extra gaps. And so it's creating more friction points in the wall to kind of help keep it stable, because all you got is gravity and friction working on your side. So you're gonna try and get as many touching points as you can. And then sometimes with stone walls that are taller than 3 feet, you'll find these through stones. So these are connecting both faces of the wall together, and they're done every couple of feet along the length of the wall. Sometimes you'll find where they actually did the through stone sticks out quite a bit from the wall and creates kind of a step up and over. So there's really fascinating when you can kind of find those, but that's those stone wall, they're connecting, but they can also use it to kind of create a step in the wall so they can get up and over those. And then your cap stones is kind of that finishing cap, big, flat. Also very similar to the through stones is connecting both sides of those. It's also kind of helping keep too much water out of it and kind of direct it, almost like a roof. It's like the roof for your stone walls. Sometimes you'll see cope stones. So these are these vertical stones that are on top of the capstone. And they can, sometimes I think they were used just aesthetically. I mean, so you see them sometimes with the state walls where I think they were adding another dimension to the wall itself. But I've read in a couple of places when were used with agricultural walls, is they created extra height without having to put so many layers up, or the uneven surface deterred goats from jumping over. There's some different theories. I don't know if they've been tested yet, but that's the understanding I've heard of why these cope stones were sometimes used. And so we'll talk a little bit about, so now we've talked about the wall construction. And when it comes to a wall, simple maintenance, or sometimes simple maintenance isn't enough, and we do have to do this larger reconstruction work and more extensive repairs. And so this is a before photo from a project that I worked on. So before I joined Historic New England, I worked at the Preservation Society of Newport County. And we, with partnership with Preserve Rhode Island, did the Aquidneck Stone Wall Initiative. And this was kind of an advocacy effort to preserve stone walls on the island, because we were seeing some of that development pressure, some of those threats like cars hitting walls and damage, and just trying to figure out like how do we help preserve stone walls. And so the first year we took on 2 sites. This is one of them. This is at Simmons Farm, historic farm that's still actively working on the island. But this wall is kind of hit our gamut of things that are threats to a stone wall, from pieces being stolen or sold off. You'll see on the side by the road, this was actually a freestanding wall, but over years they've kept raising the grade of the road to the point where the stone wall became a retaining wall on that side. There were trenches. Our contractor found trenches that were dug underneath this wall to do electrical lines. There was decaying roots from an old tree that got cut down. And so this was, kind of disaster stone wall that had everything working against it. And so when we started this project, some of us I was from, just moved to New England from the Midwest, and knew stone walls, was very, very new to stone walls. Some of my colleagues knew kind of the history of stone walls, but none of us knew anything about constructing stone walls. And so we did a workshop with the Stone Trust in Vermont, and that's where we learned those kind of 5 principles, the parts of the wall, how walls are constructed. And so we actually got hands-on in there and built a wall. We were exhausted. I don't know how masons do that day in and day out, but it was a really great learning opportunity. And it also really helped us as we were trying to make decisions about this stone wall. And so I keep saying these simple stone walls, we keep thinking they're simple, but we face questions like, how tall was this wall? This wall is now acting as a retaining wall, but was originally freestanding. Do we build it as it was, or do we build it as it would be as a retaining wall? Because it was a little bit different construction. We faced issues like, we may need more stones. What does that mean? And so these next few slides will take you through some of these considerations that we ran into. And so if you are doing kind of stone wall repair, these are things that you may have to think about or work with your contractor to figure out, or make sure that you are doing it historically if you really want to kind of keep that historical character, and making sure that you're working with them and conveying that to them. And so the first thing to consider is what type of wall you're working with. There's also the types of wall, the single wall, double wall, and that type of wall that we're talking about, but also the function of the wall types. And so we were talking about those abandoned walls through the woods. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as wild walls, where they're kind of not associated with a farm property anymore, or a house isn't on the site. And so with these, it can be that they've become part of the ecosystem, they've become a habitat. And so if you're working with a wall like this, maybe you're at a site that's got public access, and there could be a safety concern. And so maybe you do need to do some stabilization to these walls. Or, do you just leave them wild and leave them natural because now they are a habitat? And so there's some of those decisions. If you're working with a historical wall like we were, how high is the wall? Do we still do the retaining wall? Or if you have an estate wall, you really want to kind of match those characteristics. And so it's important to think kind of where the wall is at this point in time, but also what it was doing historically. And then, as I said, thinking about what type of wall it was, if you want to recreate what's there and you have a single stack wall, or if you had a double wall, you may want to maintain that type of wall. Instead of, if they're going, your contractor's like, oh, you have a single wall, but look at this great double wall we could build you. Is that what you want to do with your wall if it always was a single stack? And so some of those questions may come up depending on your site. Also the type of stone. So we ran into this where with our property, and you'll see some different examples from around Massachusetts and Rhode Island in my images here. At Gropius House, you'll see we've got kind of these bread loaf sort of shaped stones is my best description for them. But then when we were working in Middletown in Rhode Island, we got more of these pancakes, these flat, thin rocks. And so if we were building a wall in Lincoln, Rhode Island, it might not make sense to have these flat stones that we were finding in Rhode Island. But these Rhode Island, it wouldn't make sense to have bread loaves either. And so you've really kind of got to look at the local character, what types of stone you have. And what the difference here is you've got kind of granite and some of those harder stones, where in Rhode Island we were running into more slate. And so you get those different sizes and shapes and types of stones. And if you're bringing in more stone, you want to make sure that you're kind of matching the local types. And so as your question, dry laid versus mortared, you may face this question because some contractors may encourage, they've got a way that they do the mortar so it's just on the interior of the wall, but it looks dry laid from kind of the general public on the outside. But there can be challenges and disadvantages to both dry laid and mortared. So dry laid is more flexible, but it relies on friction and gravity rather than mortar to hold it together. They're easier to do spot repairs, and water drains through them naturally, so you don't have that risk of kind of freeze thaw that you might with a mortared wall. They're more traditional, but if you are dealing with an estate wall, they typically were mortared, so you may want to keep that character in mind and thinking whether, well, if it is an existing mortared wall, then we want to do the existing mortared. Or as you saw at Dole Little, at some point they had done mortar on the top to try and keep that, to stabilize that wall. I've also seen that done right here where it's just below. Sometimes it's right below the capstones because capstones are often stolen because they're, somebody's using them as a patio paver or to build their own landscape, and so they get stolen a lot. And so some public sites will mortar that capstone to keep it from getting stolen, but it can have its challenges where that mortar and that capstone are still in place, but there's a big hole that washed out below it. And so there's that risk that could happen to the wall. But if you're a site that's constantly dealing with theft of your capstones, then maybe that is the right decision for you. But you may have to deal with, this type of repair in the future because of the mortar. Let's see. And so this is the before and after photo from our first stone wall project that I worked on. And so on the left here you have the before, and I'm sorry my right photo was mid-January as the project wrapped up, and I never got a nice kind of springtime photo of it, but the contractor we worked with was really wonderful, really conscious of us as historical organizations wanting to do this as it would have been, and did a wonderful job of matching the kind of Aquidneck Island stone wall characteristics, that thin stones that we were seeing. It was a lot of work. He probably would have really preferred to work with bread loaves than pancakes, and stacking pancakes takes a lot longer. But we went through those decisions about buying stone, where does the stone come from, what the height of the wall is, do we mortar, do we not mortar? We went through all of those questions. And so it's, as we say in preservation a lot of times, it's not a one size fits all, and stone walls are the same way. So I'm hoping just some of this information kind of helps if you are involved in a stone wall project, whether at your own site or your own house or a community site, that some of these questions are out there and things to consider when you're looking at them.
Was that mortar?
Was it mortar? No, we did not mortar. And we kept this as the freestanding, just as it would have been constructed historically, even though the back side of it would never be seen and was being filled back in with dirt, as it was with the regrading that had happened. And so kind of summarizing, because I know I've thrown a lot of considerations at you, so some of the big takeaways here are: what type of wall? Is it wild? Is it historical? Is it an estate wall? Was the wall construction? What type of stone, size, color, texture are you dealing with? What's the height, width, or kind of the angles of the stone wall? What are the challenges that you need to be aware of with mortar, and is it the best solution for your site? And then gap repairs are possible. So sometimes you'll just have, the wall we were dealing with was a 200-foot long chunk that had collapsed, but sometimes you may be only dealing with 10 feet, and you can just repair that 10 feet in the middle of a wall too. And then you may not have sites, may not need this extensive repair, but there is kind of regular maintenance you can do with stone walls. Annual inspections, especially in the spring and summer as you're transitioning seasons, to make sure that vines are cleared or any displaced stones are put back in place, that you're removing debris that can collect water there. And so just some of those minor regular maintenance can go a long way to help preserve stone walls too, before you hit these kind of extensive repairs that we've been talking about. And then if you don't have stone walls but you're interested, there are a number of volunteer opportunities in the region and different organizations that have that you can go out and help preserve stone walls at another site. And so I leave with this last quote here from Dan Snow, who's actually dry stone artist, and he's really interesting work. And so he says we need to do all we can to preserve walls, but it's not necessary that they remain in the state of amber, exactly as they were 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago or even yesterday. So preservation is part of a continuum of the craft, which includes restoration. And there are good reasons to repair and rebuild historical works. And so it's as we talked about, it's the social history, it's the people who were behind it, it's the craftsmanship that went into these stone walls. There's so many different parts and stories and things that are so wonderful about stone walls as you really dig into the history. And so we encourage preservation and to dig in and learn a bit more about your own community's stone walls, or if you're walking out, I hope I've triggered some interest if you kind of are looking for those vertical lines, or if they've got the zigzag joints, or they got bread loaves or flat pancake stones, and starting to look at some of those characteristics that can be so unique from community to community. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with the stone walls in Westport, Massachusetts yet?
I'm not yet.
It's worth a trip down there.
Okay.
I promise you. That town, every wall seems to be pristine. They all look like the historical wall that you showed your picture there. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if the town has
interesting.
a lot of people that are interested in keeping them up, or their laws. It's
Westport.
I mean, definitely, if this is what your interest is, you need to go down to Westport.
Yeah, I'm always like, I kind of got, when I took the position with the Preservation Society, and they were already sort of thinking about this project, and I just kind of got, we're going to do this project, and it's just become such a fascination since I started it and learning more. And it'd be great to go see Westport and some of their stone walls examples. Yeah. We had another here?
So I'm aware of a stone wall that's in front of the house that I used to own in Franklin. How would I go about finding out whether it is in any way preserved, or if there's anything that is going to make sure that it never gets taken away?
Yeah, so I would check. I'm not sure, if Franklin has any local ordinances that protect stone walls. Sometimes communities do. The state laws usually protect walls that are along the road and in that public access kind of point. And so it's under a new owner now, right? Is that what you're saying?
It's along the street.
It's along the street.
Yeah, it's probably an easement.
Yep. Yeah, and it could be just, a lot of times the stone walls, they fall on the owners themselves, but sometimes there are local community groups that are working on stone wall preservation, and so that's where a lot of it.
Massachusetts itself has laws?
Just that state law.
That one?
Yeah, but they could be local community laws that protect stone walls, but at the state level, there's just that one with a $10 fine that's not always encouraging. Yes.
What exactly, what's the name of your organization again?
So I work for Historic New England, but I previously worked at Preservation Society for Newport County, and the Stonewall Initiative we worked on was the Aquidneck Stonewall Initiative, because we were working on Aquidneck Island, where Newport, Middletown, and Portsmouth are, and so that's where the name's derived from. Is that?
What are you working on now, or what do you do exactly? Do you build walls, or do you look around for walls that need repairs? What exactly?
Yeah, so my work now with stone walls, since I'm no longer a part of that initiative, we have, as an organization, we have stone walls on our own properties that are being maintained. And I also have preservation easement properties that are privately owned, that several of them have stone walls that are protected under the easement. So I'm not doing kind of direct project management like I was doing at the project that I showed anymore. More just kind of some of these, my biggest part is this community kind of outreach here with lectures like this with stone walls and kind of bringing awareness to them is more of where my work is now, other than personal research just to learn more and explore. But the Aquidneck Stone Wall initiative has continued, even though the original team members are not there anymore, but they're doing volunteer projects now where they're coordinating volunteers to come in and help do stone wall repairs at a couple of sites in town. And so they're it's continued past our initial project that we did, but I'm no longer involved with that project since I changed jobs.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me take that further. If we want a plumber, we call a plumber,
Yep.
et cetera, et cetera. Who do we call
Yeah.
to examine a wall,
Mm-hmm.
look at it, inspect it?
Yeah.
Nothing historical involved, I mean.
Mm-hmm. There are, so the Stone Trust in Vermont has a certification process for contractors that they'll go through a series of training and they can get certified in stone wall construction. There are also masons that, even without the certification, do stone walls, and even if they're not historical or are estate walls that work in it. So it's really looking for kind of a mason that either has that. Yeah, I mean, they may be doing kind of brick projects and stone projects just to, as they need to be kind of flexible with projects, but usually it's a mason that will do the stone wall repairs. Some of them get very focused and specialized in stone walls, and some of them do a mix of both. And some have the certification in Vermont, because they have the Vermont Trust with that certification. They have masons all over the region that have gone through that certification process. So the mason we worked with on our first project had done that, and that was where we got connected to him through the Vermont Trust. Yeah, they can be a great resource for stone walls and questions and trainings and also connecting with contractors. Yes.
I was going to say to this gentleman's point, I grew
Mhm.
up in southern New Hampshire, and the Searles family built walls throughout the Mass, and Arlington, New Hampshire, they sort of
No, it's.
walls, more like estate walls, which
Mhm.
put people to work. I'm not sure the time frame.
Yeah.
Walls, Searles Castle in New
I'll have
Hampshire,
to-
through it, walls everywhere.
Yeah, I enjoyed like putting this presentation together because I really got to dive into some of the history and also connecting with people who are aware of walls and some other ones to kind of dig into and get to know. So yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I'll definitely look into it. Any other questions? Yes.
What wall did you notice coming into town?
I saw the cemetery when I was coming in, and I come up and I saw it had it's mortared and it has the cope stones, and it caught my eye. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting detail there. Yeah. I'll have to drive around after a little bit more and see what other walls are in
It's on Elm
Franklin.
Street that my house was.
Elm Street?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's almost in Redwood.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you. So wonderful to have you all come out today and talk some walls. Thank you.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.